Well, this is all very theoretical. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. But let's see if we can put a little bit more application to this. So let's look at a couple, and really the accounting for either of these is really the same. All right, there's a couple of other the nuanced point which I think needs to be made, but it doesn't need to be made right up front. We'll make it shortly. So let's talk about restricted stock awards or units. RSAs or RSUs. Okay. You can see that the A versus the U is awards versus units. So we determine that the grant date is whatever the grant date is. Maybe the grant date is January 1st of 2020, whatever. And we're going to, from a restricted stock award perspective, we're going to award to the leadership team. We'll do this for a team versus an individual. We're going to give them 200,000 shares of stock. That's what they're going to get. And they're going to have to earn this over 4 years. So each year they're basically earning out 50,000 shares of stock. Another word for that is they're vesting. So this 4-year period is the vesting period, and each year they're vesting in 50,000 shares of stock. Or you could look at it as, yeah, it's earned over 4 years, and it's not, there's the restrictions may still hold. There may be still restrictions. Yeah, you've earned it, but there's still restrictions. You still have to finish the 4 years. You got to look at the contract. And the price of this particular stock, whatever it is, say was on January 1st, 2020, was $35 per share. So on January 1st, 2020, what is the fair value of this award? Well, take that times 200,000 and you've got a $7 million award. If I'm doing the math right. So there's a couple of different ways of accounting for this, right? Oh, and I'm going to add, there's no way to get cash, right? You have to hold it, right? If you do sell it, that's on you after it's not restricted anymore, but the company is not facilitating in paying you cash of $7 million. So because of that, just because looking at that contract and looking at the literature, I can say that this is ultimately going to stay in equity. So if we think about this each year, we're going to be recognizing $1 million, how much? 35 times 50,000 shares. So basically half of $3.5 million. So $1,750,000 each year. If we're doing the math right. So each year, we are incurring $1.75 million in compensation expense. Because there's an assumption here that it's earned evenly over the 4-year period. So how do you account for that? Well, each year you can simply issue the shares because they've earned it. There's still a restriction on it. You can issue the shares into equity, and we'll say this is no par common stock, right? If they had a par value, then, but we're gonna say it's all no par Class B shares, if you will, or class whatever, however it's defined. So here, what we would do is we're clearly going to increase equity. We'll call it additional paid-in capital. Restricted stock for the 1.75 million. What's the debit? It's compensation expense. This is one way of doing it. And by the way, you do this for both restricted stock awards and restricted stock units, right? It's really invariant. This is one approach to take. The difference between a restricted stock award versus a unit, we haven't issued the shares. If it's a restricted stock award, we've actually issued the 50,000 shares, and as long as, we have to take a look at what the restrictions are, these shares can be voted. And these shares are also going to reduce my earnings per share because these are new shares outstanding. Over here, the shares aren't outstanding yet. They will be. And it's going to affect one of our calculations of earnings per share. Diluted earnings per share. But this one's actually affecting earnings per share. Basic earnings per share. So this is one way of doing it. Another way of doing this, right? We're going to do this at the end of the year or at each reporting period, whatever it's going to be. And since you have to finish the entire year, it's likely this doesn't get booked until the end of the year. But that's a judgment call. You go to the literature, make sure you're comfortable with that. Exactly how to do this. There's another way of doing this that I can book the entire $7 million right away. Not in compensation expense, but as deferred compensation. So an alternative way of doing it is we're going to debit deferred compensation. We can do this right on January 1st for the full $7 million. And we're going to credit additional paid-in capital, restricted stock. This is not an asset. If we had deferred compensation that we're ultimately going to pay, we're going to book deferred compensation. Book the liability, book this at the same time, right? That would sit as an asset, right? It's going to be a deferred charge, a charge that we're ultimately going to have to recognize as that compensation is earned. The liability may stay there, but we can book this. But in this particular case, since we're dealing with an equity, not cash, not a liability, this deferred compensation is actually an equity account. It reduces equity. This increases equity, this reduces equity. Increases, reduces equity. And so on January 1st, nothing's happened. but I still have booked this. Now, as this gets earned out, I'm going to reduce my deferred compensation by the $1,750,000. I'm going to credit deferred compensation and debit this compensation expense. The net effect between the remainder of the deferred compensation, which will be $5.25 million, and my additional paid in capital, that's going to be, the net of those two is $1.75 million of additional paid in capital restricted stock. Just think about how that might work. Try to get your head around it. But that's how you really deal with awards versus units. And these awards are issued and they're voting. These units are not until the award is actually fully earned. Then we'll actually hand over the shares of stock. And so it'll depend on what the earnout is, the vesting period, when the shares actually get transferred over, and all of that has to be in the contract. And then you can go to the literature and figure out, okay, how do we account for that contract?